LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Shaun Chamberlin, author of The Transition Timeline and the man behind darkoptimism.org, which explores the interwoven challenges facing our global community and how we can create a joyful and resilient shared future in the face of them. Our discussion deals with the transition network and the shift to a sustainable society in response to global environmental and energy crises. Hello and welcome, Shaun Chamberlin, and thank you very much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, Shaun, we're here today in general to talk about the transition movement, both here in the UK and somewhat globally as well. And yep. The transition movement and transition towns are basically responses to the crisis we're facing regarding peak oil and, of course, climate change. And it's a broad-based...
and really the economic sort of crisis as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, who can ignore that now? And it's a broad-based plan of action. The transition movement involves awareness raising, local currencies and localism generally, self-sufficiency, and of course enabling people and the places they live to use less energy, and in that way turn what's basically a crisis into an opportunity for a radical rethink of how we live and change for the better and for a sustainable future. And most of these ideas are encapsulated in a book that you wrote in 2009 called The Transition Timeline, which people can, if they're not aware of it, can get get the skinny on the whole situation there. But before we get into the issues, perhaps you could just give us a brief bio, some background on you and how you came to get involved with this work.
Okay, well, I was basically, before getting involved with all this stuff, I was working as the manager of a learning centre for marginalised groups, so drug misusers and people with mental health problems and particularly young asylum seekers as well. And in my spare time, and this was around sort of 2000, 2001, learning about sort of peak oil and climate change in particular. And peak oil at the time was quite a fringe thing. I remember there was sort of one online resource which was called dioff.org, which is actually a technical sort of oil industry term, but it sort of sums up the sort of take on the future of civilization that the author of the website had. And so in my spare time I was learning about this stuff, and I got to the point eventually where I felt, I loved the work I was doing, but I felt, well, what's the point of helping people reintegrate with society if society itself seems to be running off a cliff, as it were? And so in the end I left that job, learned to live very cheaply, basically lived off my savings that I'd saved in that job for what ended up being about a year. Spent that time sort of reading everything I could get my hands on, going along to talks and events and harassing people who seemed to know what they were talking about. And then in 2005, I think it was, went down to a residential course at a place called Schumacher College in Devon. And some of the sort of teachers on that course were people like Richard Heinberg, who's been sort of one of the key educators on peak oil, and Rob Hopkins, who had just, at that point, basically just come up with the idea of transition towns. Another one I should mention is David Fleming, who became my sort of mentor in many ways, and he was responsible for coming up with this idea of tradable energy quotas, which is sort of energy rationing scheme. But I remember there was one guy, Ben Brangwyn, who was a fellow student on the course, and he and I were both in a similar place. We'd sort of been following one career path and felt, well, no, we really want to engage with this stuff. The course was called Life After Oil, and we were both sort of looking for what we could do that seemed sort of worthwhile and meaningful in response to it. And I remember Rob Hopkins coming in and sort of saying, I've had this crazy idea, transition towns, and we've just sort of just started doing some stuff about it here in Totnes, and do you think it's an idea that can go somewhere? And I think there were about 28 of us, I think, on the course, and we were all sort of, this sounds really exciting. And I remember Ben and I, who really clicked sort of in the first week of the course, looking at each other and going, wow, this guy's really got something. And Ben put his hand up and he said, Rob, if you had, I think he said something like, if you had $100,000 to really sort of ramp up this transition idea and do something with it, what would you do? And Rob sort of looked back at him all sly and said, why, have you got $100,000 you're looking to put into something? And Ben said, well, no, but, I think I could raise it with an idea like this. And the two of them then went off into a corner and ended up starting the Transition Network, which is the charity which sort of supports transition initiatives around the world in various ways. And so I was sort of in on the ground floor, if you like, on transition sort of taking off. And then my book emerged later when a lot of the individual transition communities were trying to produce what we call energy descent action plans, which is essentially a community looking at where they're at now and what they dream their community to look like in 20 years, given an understanding of climate change and of peak oil and of economic crisis. What would we love Kingston, for example, where I'm based, to look like in, say, 2032? And a lot of the communities were trying to do this, but they were struggling because they knew about their local needs and their local resources and their local skills, but they didn't know so much about the non-local things that were going to affect them. So from things like climate change and peak oil and how those are going to develop, but also sort of UK government policy decisions and these larger scale issues that were going to affect the local scale. And so a lot of them were sort of phoning up Transition Network and saying, well, how do we do this energy descent action plan without that? And so Rob or Ben from Transition Network sort of phoned me up and asked if I'd like to do a piece of work sort of scoping out some of these issues and doing some sort of future scenario planning around the different ways that the next 20 years could pan out. And what, over the sort of couple of years that I spent working on the project that eventually became the book, one of the things that really emerged from that was this notion of cultural stories. And I know you did a couple of interviews with John Michael Greer on this show, and he's someone who was very influential on me in terms of developing that idea. And really, it's the notion that we make sense of the world through stories. I mean, we tell our children stories in order to sort of raise them and educate them, and politicians tell us stories and narratives in terms of how wonderful life will be if they're elected, or how terrible it will be in terms of someone else elected. And these stories really shape the day-to-day decisions that we make. And as I was looking at the sort of future scenarios for primarily for the UK, but also the world, it seemed like there were three dominant narratives that really that shape our culture and the way that we respond. And I think probably that exists in all of us. And so one of those is this sort of business as usual, the kind of attitude. Nothing really changes that dramatically, and tomorrow will look basically like today, and we just sort of plod along. And you see that, for example, in government policy documents where they say, well, here's the trend over the last 20 years, and so we'll just continue that line on for the next 20 years, and we'll plan on that basis. And another really powerful story in our culture is the sort of doom story, if you like, a sort of apocalyptic vision of the future that, ultimately we're going to get our comeuppance, or, religious apocalypse, or Terminator or whatever. And we see this kind of vision of the future all over our sort of culture and in our films and books. And it's definitely something that we all sort of have inside us from our sort of cultural upbringing. And I think the third sort of dominant narrative is this notion of sort of what you might call a techno utopia, a sort of Star Trek type vision where this human ingenuity has led us onwards and upwards to this current pinnacle that society's never been more advanced than it is today, definitely tied in with sort of technological process and human brilliance. And that our manifest destiny is to have this sort of idealized future among the stars and explore the nature of reality. And all three of these sort of narratives about the future I think are in all of us, and we all probably, depending on our mood, shift from sort of feeling that one or the other of those is the likely future every day probably, and we respond on the basis of those expectations, and we shape our future on the basis of those expectations. And one of the things that we really wanted to do with the Transition Timeline book was to try and make real a fourth narrative. And the reason for that is that it's very easy looking at those three dominant narratives to see why the sort of techno-utopia vision is a much more appealing vision than the other two. And so it's very easy to see why people subscribe to that. But as other of your guests have said, the facts don't really bear it out. I mean, if you try and actually justify the notion that this is the most advanced civilization there's ever been, it's quite hard to do that. You know, we've got high rates of mental health and depression, and we're destroying our global environment at an unprecedented rate, and we're not really moving. There's this lovely Chinese proverb: if you don't change direction, you are likely to end up where you're headed. And at the moment, where we're headed on the current trajectory is, if we look with an unbiased eye at the scientific evidence, not looking too wonderful.
No, I think that, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that where things are headed is basically negating the possibility of either business as usual or the techno-utopia. I think that we can see things in decline now across a wide range of fronts, you know, man-made and natural. So business as usual is already being disrupted. That's not going to happen. And all the talk at the minute amongst politicians and economists and their ilk is getting back to business as usual as quickly as possible, but it's manifestly not going to happen. The techno future was supposed to be here 10 years ago. I talked about that with John Michael Greer, and he's very witty in his writing about sort of debunking that. That should have arrived. It's not going to happen for all sorts of reasons we can go into. I think that collapse is still a possibility, but if I was going to bet on either collapse or some kind of gradual step-down process transition to a different type of society, then it's the latter I'd definitely put my money on.
Right, but there's one very interesting thing about stories, particularly about these sort of cultural stories about the future, which is that there's a difference between our story of the future and our prediction of the future. So, for example, if you hold to a sort of apocalyptic vision, we're all doomed and humanity's going to be extinct within 50 years or whatever, then that seems a lot bleaker than a kind of business as usual perspective. But it might actually lead to a slightly better future, because at least you might make some kind of preparations on that basis. You might actually think, well, if things are going to be that bad, I'm going to try and, secure a reliable food supply for myself or my community or whatever. Whereas the business as usual believer might actually lead themselves into a bleaker actual future, because they won't in any way prepare. And so there's a distinction between the sort of future we expect, the future that we buy into, and the future that we're creating by buying into that. And that's why, as you sort of touched on there, we tried to flesh out what we called the sort of transition vision of the future, although it's gone by many other names, of course, which is it's a positive vision of the future to sort of set alongside that techno-utopia. But crucially, it's also trying to be a realistic one that actually takes into account sort of where we are and where we appear to be heading.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to offer people a vision, whether it's a technical, detailed, this is how it can be done plan, or whether it's a feeling about that it could be better. We can't maybe right now count the ways in which this would be better, but we know that a lot of what we're doing now isn't working, so we need to change it. Yeah. So across the board, offering that to people is basically the metaphorical light at the end of the tunnel, really.
Well, hopefully, certainly. I mean, the approach we sort of took in the book, after laying out these sort of four stories and where they'd be likely to lead if they sort of shape our politics and our cultural response, was to look at each of some of the critical areas in society. So looking at food and water, looking at electricity and energy, looking at healthcare, looking at all these different areas, and for each of those, laying out the facts on what's happened up to this point and the trends and where they seem to be leading. But also then laying out what we call the sort of cultural story change that could exist around around each of those things. So, for example, looking at population and demographics, sort of laying out the facts on that, and the incredible explosion of human numbers that we've seen globally over the last few hundred years, and how actually that's often presented as a great triumph, as human ingenuity and progress. And I often remember an episode of The Simpsons in which the sort of trial on the TV of an upcoming program called Man versus Nature: The Road to Victory. And that sort of sums up beautifully the kind of the cultural story that's there, is that we're overcoming nature and showing that humanity is dominant, when in fact, as any ecologist will tell you, we're part of a web of life, and that actually one life form taking up so much of the energy input of the earth essentially actually means that web is in a huge imbalance and under great stress. And of course we're seeing this great mass extinction at the moment that's taking place globally, and that actually we are massively interdependent with the rest of nature. I mean, that's where our food and our water and our oxygen, for starters, come from.
Well, this is essentially James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, which, however much any individual wants to buy into that, it's clear that if we change our perspective and see ourselves as part of this holistic system, then everything changes. That new perspective shows us the limits to what we're doing, on what we can do, and the problems created by what we have done, and it points a very clear way forward, is which the system must get into equilibrium with itself. What goes in, what we take out of it must be put back in some form or other. That's how the Earth has existed for billions of years up until relatively recently. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, it's one thing that sort of winds me up a bit in our culture is that sustainability is seen as a sort of, in an ideal world, if everything else is good and you're making a profit and you're doing well in other regards, then you can throw a bit of attention to sustainability. But we forget that sustainability, that what the word literally means, if something is unsustainable, then it's going to end by definition. And so all these processes that, as you say, we don't put back in what we take out, and we're gradually degrading the systems that support us. And especially when you bring in the exponential growth requirements of our economy, exponential growth in an unsustainable direction is very quickly moving towards its end. That's true almost simply by the definition of the words, without even having to think about it too much, I would say.
Well, it should be obvious that nothing can grow forever. You look at any system, any being, it just doesn't work like that. I mean, it's not theoretically and practically possible, but we still have, here in the UK, but it's the same in the US and in the Eurozone as well. Other parts of the world, such as Asia and South America, maybe on slightly different parts of the cycle economically. But overall, the mantra from politicians is growth, getting back to growth, talking about it, as you say, like it's a unalloyed good, when in fact what growth requires is more and more resources, more energy, and that we basically consume more of the planet.
Yeah.
And it seems that, and I was listening to the economic news today, and that even in the teeth of the situation as things are playing out now with the economic situation globally, politicians are still behaving like, the financial crisis of 2008 is over. We're about to get back to growth and generating more jobs anytime now. In fact, it'll probably be tomorrow. But of course, tomorrow never comes. And they just keep batting this off with the same platitudes, and that growth is required, our prosperity, and that somehow if the economy isn't growing, then we're not doing well.
Right. And I mean, I think it was maybe Edward Addy who said, growth for growth's sake is the ideology of the cancer cell. And if you look around nature, with the exception of things like cancer, generally things grow and then they reach a state of maturity and they stop growing. I mean, you don't take your child to the doctor because he stopped growing at the age of 21. He's reached the appropriate size. But I think it's kind of it's a bit easy for us to sort of glibly say, oh well, it's obvious, growth can't go on forever, and how is the sort of mainstream not realizing that? I mean, I think there is a deeper analysis to be made, which is that actually, our economic system is dependent on growth. Money is lent into existence. And in order to pay back the interest on that, there has to be growth. And also in order to deal with the unprecedented inequalities in the world, and to make that anything other than a tinderbox of civil insurrection also requires economic growth. And so I think it's a bit like, I sometimes use the analogy of a trip to the dentist. You know, we've got this terrible toothache and it's getting worse, but we know that going to the dentist is going to be very painful. We know that actually ending growth, that actually changing our whole economic paradigm is going to be a very painful, difficult thing, and it is likely to lead to collapse, for a given value of that term, in terms of our global economy, and that will not be, in any sense, a painless process. So it's not just sort of obvious, oh, well, we should just stop growth and everything will be fine. Actually, we stop growth, everything's going to be incredibly difficult. It's just that, and just like going to the dentist is probably going to hurt a bit. The problem is, of course, the longer you leave it, the more it's going to hurt, and we are essentially building up more and more water behind the dam, if you like, so that when we do come to the point of actually confronting the fundamental unsustainability of growth, the earlier we do it, the better. But it's very understandable in a system where politicians are elected on short-term, 4-year or so cycles, that they're very keen that the reckoning doesn't come on their watch.
Yeah, well, I should say that in pointing out the obviousness of that growth can't continue, and that certain fundamental things that need to be done, I'm under no illusions about what it would take to achieve that, and it'll probably be uglier than I'd like. But at some point we have to confront this, and as you say, the earlier we do it, the better. And we do have, in fact, the political system as it runs, as you say, short-term stints in office for politicians. They're just trying to basically get through their stint in power. You would actually have to ask yourself in this day and age why anyone would step up to get into the political arena, unless they, of course, have a calling and they're very ideologically motivated. Mm-hmm. Because it seems that a lot of the politicians, certainly in the UK and the US that I listen to, that they're trying to dodge the media. They just trot out some platitudes, another nice speech, and then just basically get out of the limelight as quickly as possible. So why are they actually doing the job that they're doing? Becoming a politician is not supposed to be a way to get rich, to make connections, to get on TV, to get your teeth fixed and get nice, hair. Mm. It's not meant to be about that. No, it is. It's supposed to be about trying to actually shape the culture in a way that produces a better future. I remember a friend of mine was asked in an interview just before the Conservative government, or the coalition government, was elected in this country, if he had any advice for David Cameron in the election campaign, and his advice was don't get elected, because the various processes that are coming to a head are so fundamentally challenging. But as you say, there isn't any appetite within the political system for changing that. And of course, there's also the argument that given that so much of our political outcomes in terms of elections are shaped by campaign finance, and given that we have a situation where the private banks are able to essentially magic money out of thin air, then there is the question of to what extent the mainstream political parties are actually able to make changes of the fundamental kinds that we're talking about, because they're to some extent in hock to those who fund them to actually get elected in the first place. Yes, and there isn't a mainstream party that is advocating for anything other than continued economic growth, and perhaps that's the reason. Well, yeah, I mean, the political control by money interests is very overt in the US because of their system, and it's not so obvious in the UK, for example, or in some other European countries. But make no mistake, that's the bottom line: is that the money talks. Yeah, absolutely. Now, the bottom line of the situation we're facing is an energy one, because everything that we do, all human activity, everything we need, everything we want, everything we get is predicated. Everything we do is energy dependent, whether it's oil or electricity. I mean, we need 24/7 electricity for virtually everything we can think of. If electricity was wiped out, if some kind of solar event knocked out the grid globally, I mean, it would be complete pandemonium instantaneously. and for a long time, if not forever. That would be it. We really have constructed our society on a
certainly in the minority world, in the so-called developing countries. I mean, there's an awful lot of the world that's existing without electricity right now, of course. So we're not talking about a universal human condition, but certainly in somewhere like the UK.
Yeah, well, the background to this is peak oil, which I've discussed with guests here numerous times, and people are still not familiar with the science behind that. They can go and check that out. But suffice to say that oil is becoming harder to get hold of. The quality of that which is being mined and drilled is going down. It's getting harder to get hold of in terms of the yield as well for any given well. But I read today in the news that thanks to the news item says improvements in production techniques, which I think they mean things like fracking, and you could argue whether that's an improvement, that US oil production is now the highest it's been for 18 years. And the International Energy Agency have forecast that the US will overtake Saudi Arabia to become the biggest oil producer in the world by 2017, and also the US will overtake Russia as the world's biggest natural gas producer by 2015. And those sort of headlines, and this was a mainstream article, give the impression that whatever people like you or I might say, whatever any activist might say, that actually, technology, the oil companies, governments, corporations, they can sort it out. Essentially, there isn't a problem.
Yeah, Rob Hopkins has a lovely analogy for this. He says it's like an alcoholic, and he's in a pub, and he's literally drunk the pub dry. There's no alcohol left in the barrels at all. And then he thinks, wow, this place has been a pub for 40 years. A lot of people must have spilt drinks in here. And so he starts boiling up the carpet to try and extract the last dregs of old alcohol that might be left there. And that's essentially where we're at. I mean, I think one of the challenges for peak oil is that at one point, certainly, I think it's happening less now, but at one point there was almost a sort of rivalry between peak oil activists and climate change activists, almost, arguing about, which was the more urgent or which was the more pressing problem. And in fact, of course, what we've got is both, and they interact in a complex but definitely understandable way. You do sometimes hear this sort of slightly naive idea that, well, peak oil is going to save us from climate change, that nature's almost taking our toys away because, we've proved we can't live with them, and so there isn't going to be enough fossil fuels for us to banish things, and that's clearly not the case. I mean, we've already raised the temperature of the planet by almost a degree, and we're looking at various positive feedback. So it's perfectly clear that there is enough fossil fuel there to exacerbate the climate problem. And in fact, what's also fairly clear is that peak oil actually makes the climate change problem a lot worse. And that's because we wouldn't be doing things like, the things you're referring to, the tar sands and the shale gas. We wouldn't be doing things like that if there was still cheap, easily accessible oil and gas available. I mean, it is scraping the barrel or boiling up the carpet, as I was saying. And the reason that it's that we wouldn't be doing that is because the energy return from those things is much poorer. It takes more energy to get the fuel out of the ground, and then the fuel you get actually contains less energy, so you're getting less sort of energy profit, if you like. But also things like particularly tar sands are exceptionally high in terms of both regional environmental damage and, of course, carbon emissions. And so actually peak oil is making the climate challenge worse because it's pushing us to more and more carbon-intensive forms of energy in our desperation to replace the cheap and easy oil. And one thing I think is not widely recognized yet is that, we know very clearly that we've got more than enough carbon in the fossil fuels that we've already discovered to bring about catastrophic changes in our climate and environment. So the clear necessity is to leave existing fossil fuels in the ground. But that actually turns the whole scarcity paradigm on its head, if you like. If we were actually serious as a species about preventing climate change, then you end up in a situation where unexploited fossil fuel reserves are essentially sort of valuable but dangerous resources that we end up having to sort of guard against people who are trying to pull them out of the ground and use the energy bonanza that they represent, which we know collectively we can't. So you can end up in a situation where you have sort of governments guarding their fossil fuel reserves to prevent extraction if we were in a world where there actually seemed to be any political will whatsoever to actually address the climate situation.
Yeah, it's a bit like in Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, which is something I end up citing very often. And they've come through this horrendous crash in society.
Yeah.
Humanity seems to have gone two ways. One group are trying to cooperate and put something like civilization back together again. The others are just, roaming, I can't think of the word, but just warriors really preying on people. Yeah. And all that the civilized people can come up with is to start refining oil again.
Right.
It's almost like it's so associated with civilization, the growth of, and everything that we do, that their response is, okay, well, we've got to find a way to get oil back again. And what we're trying to imagine here is something beyond that, and that because we don't know what that is, doesn't mean that we shouldn't start thinking about it. And this is what the whole, transition idea is about, to begin saying, okay, what could there be? Because even if there was unlimited, well, nothing's unlimited, but even if there was colossal amounts of easy to get at oil, there's a strong argument to be made, an environmental one, that we should just realize that actually this was, not a good idea ultimately, or we had our fun, and that we should move to something else.
Well, absolutely. Given that the climate science is telling us that we're in danger of fundamentally disrupting the planet's ability to support humanity, certainly in anything like the numbers that we currently have, you tend to think that was a fair indication that it might be time to try a different route. But one of the things that sort of is a challenge for transition, I think, is that it's fundamentally a community-led process. Local initiatives sort of decide what's appropriate for their community and adapt accordingly, trying to reduce their carbon footprint and to reduce their dependency on money to a large extent as well. To start to rely on each other rather than relying on this sort of fictional notion of financial independence. But one of the challenges for transition is that, of course, climate change by its nature is the kind of problem where if some people reduce their emissions but the rest of the world doesn't, then you don't have a solution. It's not something you can really just solve for yourselves, as it were. And certainly within our current competitive economic framework, if one community or one country reduces its oil use, for example, then all that does is reduce the price a bit, which encourages somewhere else in the world to use more of it. And this is why transition is also sort of exploring this concept of TEQs, TEQs, tradable energy quotas, which is a sort of policy framework for addressing peak oil and climate change. And it's a way of basically turning around that paradigm so that actually you have your national carbon budget or your national amount of oil or gas that is available to you or that you wish to use, and then basically shares that out fairly. And here, I think, in terms of moving this towards implementation, we can talk more about the details of TEQs, if you like, and how it would function. But in terms of actually getting the political traction to make this happen, I think here we get back again to the importance of those cultural stories that shape our decision making. Because if your story of life of humanity and our progress is that we're ingenious, there's basically unlimited potential energy out there for us to discover or find or extract or invent, then from that mindset, if someone comes to you and says, well, we're going to actually need to limit your consumption of that because, well, for any reason, then they're clearly the enemy and they need to be opposed and they need to be fought against as hard as you can because they're trying to limit this incredible human progress and improvement in living standards. Whereas if you come from a story which says, well, actually, all the evidence is telling me that we are reaching the limits of what we can, certainly of the energy we can extract without huge deleterious consequences from doing so, then the obvious question becomes, well, how do we most fairly share out what is available? And so that difference in fundamental mindset, I think, is what we need to be focused on changing before we can actually, to some extent, get into making the scale of changes that are necessary at the sort of global, national, political type levels.
One of the major hurdles, as I see it, which is still presenting itself, looming very large even in the teeth of this economic crisis, is that we have a consumption culture in the West, and that of course is now taking off in a big way in China, other parts of Asia, and to an extent in some South American countries are starting to catch up in terms of consumption. And of course, if we talk then about cutting or reducing demand in certain areas of the economy that are ostensibly, unnecessary, put that in quotes, because different people have different ideas about what that is, then that has an effect on jobs, and that's all tied in with what we were talking about earlier, growth. But as long as people feel that a lot of their well-being and happiness is somehow entangled with buying stuff and owning things, and that if they don't have that stuff, then they're worse off and will be unhappy, well, that's a huge problem for us to get around.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's been some fantastic work done by a group called the New Economics Foundation around this topic, basically looking at how for some of the poorest people in the world, there is actually a correlation between sort of income and well-being, if you like. Because, at the level where you're struggling to feed your family or to find any shelter, then, the ability to do that obviously does increase your well-being. And then perhaps beyond that, there's a point of sort of comfort at which, again, up to that point, having more material resources does increase your well-being or your fulfillment. But it seems, based on some work they've done called the Happy Planet Index, that it's only up to a level of around a national average income of about £10,000 a year that effect holds. And beyond that point, income appears to make absolutely no difference whatsoever to people's self-reported levels of contentment or fulfillment. And that, I think, is one of the key ideas, key cultural stories, if you will, that we need to be sort of disseminating and spreading, because it makes sense to us in a sort of intuitive level as well. That obviously you need to be able to eat and drink and have somewhere to lay your head in order to be content. But there does come that point at which you start feeling like your possessions are owning you, and your life's getting too full of various sort of material commitments, and maybe even there's the point of sort of extravagance at which your level of contentment actually starts going down as your material wealth increases.
Oh yeah, I mean,
so I think really the fundamental concept that we're missing is the simple one of enough. To the point where actually we've had enough, and now maybe we can continue exploring our fulfillment in other ways, maybe in kind of spiritual exploration, or maybe in terms of our relationships, or our appreciation of nature, or whatever it might be for you as an individual, art or dancing or whatever. But maybe there is a point of enough when it comes to that material.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in the Happy Planet Index that you mentioned, it's rather telling that if you put it to, say, a lot of people in the UK, for example, maybe who don't have a lot of experience of visiting the US, but they certainly know a lot about American culture. They'll know significantly less about Mexico, for example, and Mexican culture. But if you say, okay, you're going to be forcibly relocated to the States or Mexico, choose, I'd imagine the vast majority would say, okay, the States. But on the Happy Planet Index, Mexico is near the top. Yep. And the US is languishing somewhere like 163rd on that. Which,
sort of better the devil you know kind of approach.
Yeah, quite. And that indicates, and you say the self-reported as well. That's very important. It's not some kind of...
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that obviously it's a very hard thing to measure, sort of well-being or fulfillment. As I recall, the approach they took was a very simple one, and they just asked people over the last year, how would you rate your sort of happiness or satisfaction with life on a 1 to 10 scale? And I think it was that simple. Basically, it was how happy and content do you feel with your way of life? And in a way, it seems sort of almost absurdly simple, but it's not a bad way probably of measuring that.
No, it's simple because people will sometimes lie to themselves with regards to something like how well their life is going and do they enjoy their work. because they don't want to admit that they're unhappy or that they're not satisfied with things, or that they would rather be doing something else or be with someone else or be somewhere else. But I think I'm noticing across a broad spectrum now, and it's not as widely reported as it should be, but there is sometimes with reluctance, sometimes with great gladness, but there's an interest in a lot of people in minimizing things in their life, in simplifying, in getting back to basics. And I find that very encouraging. As I said, you won't find it on the nightly news or in most of the mainstream papers, what have you, because it's not, basically our news is seen as bad news, is the only news that there is. But there are a lot of things happening at the grassroots. Yeah,
I mean, there's sort of a radical historian called Howard Zinn in the US who wrote a book called The People's History of the United States, and I always remember a sort of piece of advice he put out there, which was, look for alternatives. Look for the stuff that the media aren't reporting. Look for the kind of cracks in the mainstream narrative, if you want, and you will find it. But then always remember that there's 1,000 times more happening that you didn't find. And so don't sort of get depressed by the fact that it seems like the mainstream is quite consistent in some quite sort of depressing ways, because actually they're deliberately ignoring all that's happening, and we're not the only people having this conversation, and the truth will out, if you like, and there are a lot of people acting in a lot of ways that we'll never hear about, and it's important to remember that. And I think in terms of the question of sort of growth and consumption, another piece of work which I think is essential is Professor Tim Jackson wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth, and that's another exceptional exploration of how our economies could function without growth in a way that still allows for sort of growth in well-being and in prosperity, as he puts it. And this is really why, coming back to energy, I'm very excited by this idea of tradable energy quotas, because it provides a way of looking at our current energy consumption and saying, okay, we need to actually reduce that. We need to basically stop scraping the barrel in terms of the supply, the energy supply side of the equation, and start looking at our demand and saying, well, okay, how can we live happy, fulfilled lives using less energy? But what I really like about it is that it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't provide the answer. It doesn't provide a top-down answer. It doesn't say, well, we've thought about it, we've decided this is the best approach, and so we're now going to, enforce that on everybody in the sort of, what's often characterized as sort of green fascism, if you like. But rather it takes an approach very much in tune with the transition towns, and basically says, okay, we've got this strict cap on energy use in the country, and it's declining over time. And so we're going to give out rations, essentially quotas, to people on an equal per capita basis, but they're tradable. So if you're particularly energy thrifty, and you've already done a lot of work to reduce the energy dependency of your lifestyle, then you can actually sell your quotas to someone else who needs more of them, whether because they haven't really paid attention to it, or simply because they have a job like a country doctor or someone that just involves driving around a lot and using a lot of energy. And so it provides a sort of a reward and an incentive to people for the work that they are doing, but it doesn't sort of criminalise the people who are still living in a high carbon way. And crucially, the people who are living in a high carbon way, they're paying for that, but they're not paying it to the government. There's no sort of grand overseeing body. They're paying it to those who are being more energy thrifty. So in the same way that the government doesn't need to oversee every cash transaction to make sure that the right amount of money changed hands, they don't need to oversee every text transaction. It's something that can be a sort of light touch in terms of regulation and oversight.
So this is a little bit like the idea that has been proposed for reform of the tax system to tax consumption rather than earnings.
Yeah, or indeed land, which is one thing that the Caroline Lucas, our Green MP in the UK, has been talking about, is taxing people on land ownership as well.
That'll be interesting. You get someone like Land Securities then who buy up all this land and sit on it for decades. That would sort them out.
Yeah, right, exactly. And crucially, it then allows for the sort of collective ingenuity of individuals and communities to figure out ways of reducing their energy dependency, whether that's, collective energy cooperatives, or whether it's sharing lifts, or whether it's organising a bike repair workshop so they can get everyone's bikes in working order so they don't need to use the car, or whether it's things that, I haven't thought of and I'm not going to think of. And I think it's very important that any sort of policy that's brought in around this stuff shouldn't be, we've got together the top experts, they've decided this is the right way to do it, and so we're going to enforce it. It should be putting in place a framework that allows people to find their own solutions, because every community and every individual's lifestyle is very different, and it's these kind of bottom-up approaches that I think make sense. I think the line that David Fleming, who invented the scheme, who's passed away now sadly, but the line that he had, which actually radically changed my own thinking around this stuff, was large-scale problems do not require large-scale solutions. They require small-scale solutions within a large-scale framework. And that's what text provides, really. It provides the framework to encourage and incentivize local ingenuity around energy, and crucially, people to work with each other, in that, if you see that your supermarket is leaving its freezers open and wasting a load of energy, then you're incentivized to sort of harass them about that, because they're pushing up the price of the quotas for everybody. But also it encourages that sense of common purpose, really, in the country, to say, right, we're collectively going to address this, and we're going to address it together in whatever way seems appropriate at the local scale.
Yeah, you mentioned the phrase green fascism a few moments ago, and I think there's definitely a bit of a blockage here with some people, in that, feeling that they're being dictated to, whether it's by someone like Al Gore, who doesn't exactly walk it how he talks it, or whether it's grassroots activists who sometimes, if they're particularly militant, can not come across very well in terms of saying, you must stop eating meat, you must become a vegan, you must start wearing hemp sweaters, and what have you. And it's very much a question of how this is presented to people, and if they feel that, inevitably a lot of people will feel that they're losing out, but if they feel that someone's saying you have to give up your luxuries and comforts and live in austerity for the good of the earth and mankind going forward in perpetuity, it's a tough sell.
Well, that's right, and it's kind of, when you have those scenarios where someone's sort of lecturing someone else about their environmental responsibilities and the other person's responding with disgust, it's very easy to understand both sides of that. I mean, your sort of angry greenie is feeling, well, for God's sake, the consequences of this are completely overwhelming, and your desire to eat meat is kind of irrelevant compared to the scale of those consequences, and you need to understand this. And it's equally very easy to understand where the other person, if they're coming from a different sort of cultural narrative in which, it's all about human progress and it's all about individual freedoms and individual choices, well, then they're going to feel, well, hang on, that's your lifestyle choice and that's fine, and this is mine and that's fine, and what gives you the right to tell me what I should do with my life? And this is why I think the sort of challenge that we face is that really if I can generalize, what environmentalists are trying to do is not to impose limits on anything, really. What they're trying to do is recognize the limits that already exist, recognize the limits that are out there that our scientists are telling us about, and find a way to respond accordingly. But of course, if people don't recognize that those limits exist in the first place, then the person who's trying to talk about solutions to those limits is going to sound like they're trying to impose the limits. And again, as I was saying a little earlier, I think this is why fundamentally what we need to do is meet people where they're at and listen to them, really, because I think it would be an unusual person, certainly in the UK, who hasn't got some awareness of the consequences of the limits we're banging up against, the destruction of nature and of climate change and of rising fuel prices. I mean, people know that these things are happening, whatever their perspective is. And so really, if you actually, rather than going in and saying, look, I've got all the answers and you need to listen to me and you need to act on them, if you actually just ask people, what do you think about rising fuel prices? What do you think about David Attenborough on the television saying how all the stuff he's been teaching us about in BBC Nature documentaries is being destroyed? How do you feel about these things? And then you've got a basis for a conversation, because maybe, there are things they know that you don't know, or maybe there are things you know that they don't know, and you can actually discuss them. And I think that collectively, as a society and as a species, it's very clear that if we respond accordingly to the evidence that our scientists are collecting, there are better and worse ways to go, and we can all recognise those. And it's only when our conversations come from this very oppositional energy that we fail to find that. And so in a lot of ways, I would say it's more important to get people on side and be able to talk to them and meet them where they're at than it is to feel the overwhelming urgency of converting them or convincing them, despite the fact that the environmental crisis is overwhelmingly urgent.
Yes, I've spent some time going along and speaking with people involved with the Zeitgeist movement, which you're probably aware of.
Yeah.
And one of the sort of things that concerned me a little bit was all the good intentions and some good work, awareness raising being done. And of course, the Zeitgeist films do a lot in that respect. There's still a sense within the groups that I met with that it was sort of us and them type thing.
Yeah.
And I just felt they were storing up conflict, and in their interactions with sort of members of the public, other members of the public, trying to disseminate the information, there was already a sort of a barrier there, which was a bit unhelpful. And as you say, talking to people on their own terms, rather than just sort of saying, everything's on the brink of collapse, we must do this right now.
Yeah. Here's the answer, all you need to do is sign up, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly, because I think a lot of people join movements and what have you and become card-carrying members and go along to a lot of talking shops, but then not actually a great deal happens. There's definitely a danger of that as well.
Yeah.
Awareness is not enough. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think Zeitgeist it's not something that I've sort of heavily engaged with, because to be honest, there's sort of two hesitations I had about it. I mean, one is that it's very much still part of the kind of high technology, human ingenuity and progress narrative, which, as I say, I think is one of the fundamental things that we need to challenge. But also, as you were saying, it's got this this sort of advocacy without too much action thing about it. Somehow, I'm yet to see, and maybe I've missed it, but I'm yet to see a on-the-ground project helping people that's been organised by the Zeitgeist movement. It seems to be, to a large extent, people meeting up and agreeing with each other that human development should be moving in a particular direction. Mm-hmm. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't a great deal happening on the ground to move things in that direction beyond, as you say, a pretty good effort at sort of awareness raising. And so I'm sure it prompts a lot of interesting thinking and discussion around important issues, and I'm sure it moves a lot of people in a positive direction. But it isn't something that sort of personally, inspired me to sort of pour my time into, as it were.
No, well, in terms of the techno utopia future, that possible or perhaps impossible scenario, for a while the Zeitgeist movement actually grew out of something called the Venus Project, which was practically a one-man band consisting of a guy called Jacques Fresco. Now, he produced some really good theoretical ideas and some of the most stunningly beautiful designs for buildings I've ever seen. But he's a very old man now, and he's been on this trip of his since at least the 60s, as far as I know. And he hasn't found any backers, and nothing materially has happened from all his plans. And that tells me something. Maybe he's difficult to work with, but it does tell me something,
Well, really... I mean, I've read some very, very beautiful science fiction, and I find science fiction a beautiful thing. I mean, it's a way of exploring possible futures in a creative and enjoyable and interesting way. But there does come a point at which you have to take the things that you've gleaned from that and bring them back to reality and implementation. And another line actually from David Fleming, he said once that he thinks localization stands at best at the limits of practical possibility, but it has the decisive argument in its favour that there will be no alternative. And
Yes.
and I think in our sort of world of energy descent, we do need to be looking at where we are really in a more realistic way, rather than looking to where we long to be. And then if we actually engage with where we are and make that more beautiful, then we sort of live with the questions, if you like, rather than feeling the need to have the answers. And we can live along step by step, holding those questions and exploring them the best we can. And, maybe someday we live along into the answers, but I find that, leaping decades or even centuries ahead to, that's where humanity's going to get to. It's often more of an escape or a distraction than a help in terms of actually ameliorating the human condition.
Oh, in terms of the human condition, it's just a classic thing that we do, which is we're lost in the past or the future,
right?
And quite often to our detriment, whether it's in our personal lives or globally. But you mentioned a book earlier called Prosperity Without Growth.
That's right.
Which I have read, because a lot of people, their understanding of economics, the economic cycle, is that this boom and bust thing that we're talk so much about is inevitable. But of course, it's very destructive, and it's not at all inevitable. No. It's sometimes deliberately engineered, other times just a byproduct of the economic system as it operates currently. But there's a concept called a steady state economy out there. Now, is that something that it's kind of, the explanation of it is in the title. It would be possible for us to get to a point where we can eliminate these cycles of boom and bust.
Yeah, I mean, it's a guy called Herman Daly who was the sort of the pioneer of that idea. And in some ways, as you say, the explanation is in the title, and it's obviously the alternative to a growth-based economy. But in some ways, it isn't. In that, it can be misleading, the title of a steady-state economy, in that it sort of gives the impression of everything somehow being in stasis, like we sort of almost press the pause button on the world and just hold it as it is. And of course, that would be profoundly unrealistic. So there's still space for creativity and for progress and for invention, but it's just that the economic framework built around that is not built on this same sense of perpetual debt and of perpetual growth. And it's quite a sort of technical economic discussion to get into all the arguments for and against that. But certainly it has the fundamental advantage that, as somebody once said, anyone who thinks that infinite growth on a finite planet is possible is either a madman or an economist.
Yes.
In fact, it may have even been Herman Daly who said that initially. I'm not sure.
Well, money and economics should stem from the resources that we have and the needs of human activity and interaction, not the other way around. It just seems that money has become this. It has got its hands on the controls, and it's the other way around. So it doesn't matter what the resource situation is. Money talks. Money trumps that. And no matter what human needs are and the needs of the planet, money talks and trumps that as well.
Well, right. I mean, I think what's really useful here is to take a sort of more of a deep historical perspective, at least in terms of human history, and to think about, what did we have before we had this sort of growth economy? Because, and as people have said, at the moment it seems almost easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism as it is. And yet we can look at historical examples, and human history goes back something in the order of a couple of 100,000 years. And for most of that time, based on the sort of anthropological and archaeological research of these things, it seems that humanity actually lived essentially in what they call a gift economy, which is one that isn't based on exchange at all. It's much more like the economy. I mean, it's worth remembering that economy is a word that's sort of been hijacked in a way. I mean, economy just means the way that we provide for our needs. It's just we're so used to the dominance of the money economy that we tend to think that economics and finance are synonyms. And in fact, they're not. Finance is one way of providing for our needs. It's one way of achieving an economy. But if you look, for example, within a family, when you're born and your mother breastfeeds you and your family, bring you food and look after you, there's no sense of exchange there. It's just a case of well, this member of our family has needs and we want to provide for them because we love them. And you see that, go on in family relationships generally. I mean, if your parents come over for dinner, you cook them a meal, you wouldn't dream of charging them for it. It would seem, offensive and inappropriate to do so. And yet what we've seen particularly over the last couple of centuries, is that the realm of the gift economy has been pushed back and back and back and back by the realm of the money economy. So even things like childcare, for example, now it's quite an ordinary thing to pay someone for childcare. 100 years ago, that would have seemed just as bizarre as paying or asking your parents to pay you for cooking them a meal. And so we've got this ever increasing domain of monetary domination. And again, to go back to the creation of money, if you've got people who can create money out of nothing, essentially, who've been given that power, and then the monetary economy is stretching into more and more aspects of our lives, then in effect you do have slavery. I mean, you do have a situation where people are creating these sort of money vouchers, if you like, and then they can tell other people what to do if they want to get their hands on them. And more have taken away alternative ways for people to meet their needs. It's ever more difficult to find a way, to find a place to live, to find food, etc., without getting it through money. And so I think one of the other things that is really exciting a lot of people in the transition movement at the moment is this notion of the gift economy, and it's being championed by people like Charles Eisenstein, who wrote a book called Sacred Economics, and also a friend of mine called Mark Boyle, who's just brought out a book called The Moneyless Manifesto. And he actually lived for 2.5 years in the UK without using any money at all. And what I think is exciting about this gift economy is that it allows people to get past the slightly deluded notion of financial independence, because we have this notion in our culture that being financially independent is a very good and worthwhile thing to strive for and to achieve, and you're a responsible member of society if you're not financially dependent on anybody else. But actually, financial independence is a myth, because if you are, quote, financially independent, you've got enough money to pay for everything that you might need, you're not in any real sense independent. I mean, somebody is still growing your food somewhere in the world. Someone is still providing the services that you use somewhere in the world. It's just that you don't know them. Whereas historically, you got those services maybe from the village farmer or the village blacksmith or whoever, and you had a relationship with them, and it was out of that relationship that you, to some extent, provided for each other's needs. Now we've replaced relationships with money, and we've come to depend on money instead of depending on each other. But we call that independence, and that is quite a powerful and devious twist of language, just as it's a subtle and devious twist of language to conflate economics with finance. And so I think one of the key things that the transition movement is also doing is trying to push back against the money economy and force it out of some places, so that again we can come to rely on each other again. And there are various initiatives like Free Cycle, you might have heard of, and there's a website called Just for the Love of It and the Free Economy Movement. And particularly in those countries which are on the forefront of the financial crisis. I've been talking to transitioners from Portugal and from Greece and from Ireland, and they're saying, as people recognize that the financial economy and money is no longer able to offer them the life that they want to live and no longer able to support them reliably, more and more they're going back to relying on their families, relying on their communities. And I think one crucial thing that I've learned through years of sort of community organisation and engagement is that you can't really do community by meeting every Tuesday at 7 o'clock to be a community organisation. Community only really exists in a true sense when people need each other, when people actually rely on each other for something that they can do without. And I think that's what transition's becoming more and more about, is providing the essential services, or empowering people to provide to each other the essential services that make their lives possible, so that it's not just one more financial interaction. Like, if you go to the supermarket, you buy your food from a checkout lady. If you fall out with her, it doesn't matter, you'll just go to a different checkout lady the next day. But if you're actually dependent on each other, you've got an incentive to work through the difficulties, work through the different cultural stories. So, your would-be green fascist has got a reason to actually maybe moderate themselves a little and engage with the person who thinks that they're out of this world, and vice versa, and to actually build those deeper relationships that come from working through difficulties together.
Well, this really is what we're talking about here, is localism, which is a big central plank in the transition concept, because with the opposite of that, we basically have globalization, which has been was increasing throughout the 20th century, and we were told all the way along that not only was it inevitable, but it was natural, it was desirable, it was beneficial. But of course, it was only beneficial from before, basically, those who were telling us that it was inevitable, natural, and desirable. And it's essentially a race to the bottom in terms of resources and economics. We see that with, jobs, so many US manufacturing jobs, for example, being outsourced to China, and then Chinese workers decide they want a better standard. So it can't be, it's not a process, again, that can go on forever. There is a bottom and there's no basement. You get down there and that's it. And because of that, we now see globalization starting to go in, well, for many other factors as well, globalization going into reverse somewhat. One of the side effects being that it is affecting employment, and that feeds into what you were saying about people having to look elsewhere to sustain themselves.
Yeah.
And we also have, the issue of technological unemployment, which is basically machines putting people out of work. That's ongoing, including in places like China and India, which had been undergoing something of an economic boom for a little while there. So all of this feeds back into what you just summed up, really, in more local approaches to everything. And this is somehow portrayed in the media as a little bit, maybe slightly sort of jingoistic. And, when British politicians are calling to get out of the EU, they're called, little Englanders, and they're small-minded, and we can't go back to the way our grandparents did things, etc., etc. But of course, we may end up there anyway.
Well, I think yes and no. I think there's a danger of caricaturing it as, going back to the past. That is something that never happens. As any complexity theorist will tell you, a complex system never returns to exactly its former state. So, there are genuine. Technology is a very loaded term as well. Technology is everything from the development of language to the development of a microchip. It's a very broad term, and so to say that technology is a good thing or technology is a bad thing is a bit of an absurd statement. But certainly, there are certain kinds of technologies that we've developed over this sort of bonanza of energy, which has freed us to be much more innovative, which will be incredibly useful to us in an era of energy descent. And there are some which will very quickly jettison. And I think the reason why, as you say, that tide of globalization is inevitably turning basically comes back to thermodynamics ultimately, which is probably the most established principles in physics, in science as we know it. And basically, if you're globalized, if you're shipping meals thousands of miles from where they're grown to where they're consumed, if you're exchanging 20,000 tons of some good with a country and they're sending 20,000 tons of the same good back to you, well, this fundamentally takes an awful lot of energy, and energy in useful forms has limits, in terms of peak oil and the things that we've been talking about. And so it doesn't really matter on that level what our cultural stories are or what our beliefs are about the future. Ultimately, thermodynamics will have its way. Science, physics doesn't really negotiate, despite the famous pronouncement that the American way of life is non-negotiable. I think physics is more non-negotiable, and so yes, essentially we are seeing the return of localization. That quote I was saying earlier has the distinct argument on its side that there is no alternative, and I think that can be a really positive thing. If we spend all our time like the mainstream media would like to, holding desperately to that sort of techno utopia story and saying, I will not negotiate this, I will fight against scientific reality with all my might, then the actual future that we create is going to be very unpleasant, because we're going to be, digging our fingernails in and being dragged across the floor by the inexorability of the energy descent. Whereas if we actually recognise the future that we're moving into and say, okay, well, we explored that maybe doesn't have a future, so, let's take the best of that and incorporate it with the best of what our grandfathers did, then hopefully we can build together a transition vision of the future which will guide us to a place which is a lot less difficult than it needs to be.
And perhaps a chance to focus on what's really important in life.
Absolutely. I think maybe it's a good note to end on. There's a line which I'm sort of finding deeply inspiring at the moment, actually, which is by a writer called Wendell Berry. And he wrote once that protest that endures, I think, is moved by a hope far more modest than that of public success, namely the hope of preserving qualities in one's own heart and spirit that would be destroyed by acquiescence. And that really kind of sums it up for me. We don't react against the absurdities of kind of mainstream culture and the appalling consequences of mainstream culture, because we know that we're going to succeed. Because we know that we're going to be able to turn this around. Because on climate change, for example, there's a very strong case that we're not going to be able to avoid a sort of runaway destabilization of our climate. But the reason that people get burned out is because they make their activism or their work dependent on success in that way. Whereas if we do it just because it's who we are, because it's what we believe in, and it's the kind of life we actually want to live, then that is actually a sustaining thing. It's a delightful thing. And it's this idea of doing the thing that makes you come alive, basically, rather than the thing that you feel is appropriate or necessary, because that's more of a brain decision, if you like. Whereas I think we need to trust our heart and our spirit and follow the paths that inspire us.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Shaun, just to wrap up, listeners can go online and find the Transition Movement website quite easily, and they can find out what's happening near them with regards to this. But perhaps you'd just like to tell us about your websites, publications, events, anything at all you'd like to put out there.
Well, my website is called darkoptimism.org, and that's a sort of exploration of all the various things that we've talked about today. I've also in a few publications recently. There was a book last year called Grow Small, Think Beautiful, which was a sort of development of Schumacher's thinking around this. And this year, two books, one called The Future We Deserve, and another one called What We Are Fighting For, which is an interesting piece from Pluto Press, which is sort of looking at the massive protests that there have been around the world, and sort of trying to answer the question that the mainstream media are always putting to people, like, do you actually know what you're complaining about? Do you actually know what you want? And so that's pulled together a very diverse group of activists and thinkers to sort of answer that question and lay out a sort of radical collective manifesto. I'd say that's called What We Are Fighting For, and that's out a few months ago, I think.
Shaun Chamberlin, thank you very much for joining us today on legalisefreedom.com.
It's been a pleasure, Greg.
Well, that's it for another week. As always, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please check out the website. That's legalise-freedom.com. You can spell legalise with an S or a Z, matters not. There you will find an archive of programmes on many equally fascinating topics. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalisefreedom.com.